It's time once again for Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for 5 years has shared with us her extensive research into political assassinations and abuses of power in this country. Her program relates the news of the week to emerging evidence about the conspiracy which allegedly maintains by force its control over the legislative, executive, and judicial processes in America. And now, Mae Brussell.
Good afternoon. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and this Dialogue Conspiracy number 259, and it's March the 7th, 1977. And I have here at KLRB as my guest Paul Krassner, and we'll explain for those of you who do not know Paul Krassner who he is. How do I explain Paul Krassner, those that don't know you by name? How would you define yourself?
I'm just an urchin.
You're an urchin. No, you're a publisher. You were the courageous publisher of the first three articles that I ever published. How, for the new listener, do you describe yourself?
Well, I'm half journalist and half satirist. I'm sort of an investigative satirist.
I remember when you came in the house, and I'd been subscribing to The Realist for about 10 years, and you moved out to California, and we met, and you saw the article I was writing, how Richard Nixon came to power, and you bought it right away and gave me $200, and I think I pinned that check up on my bulletin board or on my dress, and so after 8 or 9 years research, that was the first article I was selling. And didn't you say that you did this for Lenny Bruce? This was the first money he ever received?
No, that was there was an article that I did on Lenny, and for which I got $1,000, so I just gave him $500, and this was in Christmas of 64 or 65, and nobody ever had given anybody who did an article about anybody part of the money. But he was really broke, and he pinned it to his dungaree jacket. And then later I found out there was a seance that was held. And his mother brought his dungaree jacket to the seance, and the safety pin was still in the pocket there.
Oh, really?
That he had pinned the money to it with.
What was your relationship to Lenny Bruce?
Well, we were close friends. As a comedian, as a fellow comedian, he saw me perform once at the Steve Allen Theater, and he wanted to manage me. But I just didn't want to do nightclubs, so I was just doing colleges and stuff. And then for Playboy, I edited Lenny's autobiography, How to Talk Dirty and Influence People. And, we just hung around, learned a lot from each other, and including paranoia.
How long has The Realist been in print now? How many years?
It started in 1958, and then the last issue I published was your Patty Hearst issue in 1974. So it's been about 3 years I haven't published it. I'm going to start again, hopefully, in a few months. I lost my second-class mailing privileges in the meantime, so I'm just going to start a new magazine and call it The New Improved Realist.
New Improved Realist.
Design it like a detergent box.
How would you describe it for the listeners in terms of what was published up to that time? It was a breakthrough in journalism. It was a first, and just today at the bookstore, we picked up a magazine that Paul's name is mentioned in there, in a book review, a new book that's out. And
Tom Wolfe's book mentions me.
Tom Wolfe's new book mentions Paul Krassner, and he's very much in the news and in magazine articles now in studying the 50s, 60s, early 70s. How would you describe The Realist when it first came to press?
Well, first of all, it came out of a tradition. It's considered the first contemporary underground or alternative publication. But before that, there was a paper called The Independent, for which I worked, and before that, there was a publication called In Fact. And when I did research when I first started, it went back into the 1890s with a publication in Waco, Texas, called The Iconoclast. So it followed in a certain tradition of independent journalism. I just recognized no taboos. I wanted to be able, as Lenny Bruce wanted to talk in nightclubs the way he talked in his living room, I wanted to write in The Realist the way I talked in my living room, and which included 4-letter words. And at that time, they weren't as free as they were now. I mean, you could really get in trouble there. And I had to have a note from my lawyer every time I used a 4-letter word. But I just thought I just didn't want to insult the readers, and have asterisks, because there was a whole generation of readers who used to get sexually aroused by seeing asterisks. So there was no hope.
Well, when you published my story on Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped, there was this fantastic cartoon, which I have here, called Rose America's Baby, with the Statue of Liberty being raped by the news media and the Pope and Cronkite and Lee Harvey Oswald and Sirhan, and you've got FBI and Buffer and all the products the TV sells identical to network. And I had to tear out the centerfold cartoon to many people I mailed the article to, because even though it was published as late as 1972, it offended so many people. They said, well, how can you put that out? And yet they will give an Academy Award to a movie like Network, which is the same thing that you were saying visually. And the irony was that the 17-minute tapes or 18-minute tapes at the White House were edited by Rosemary Woods, and you have Rosemary's Baby and the birth of this double government, and in cartoon form it is absolutely brilliant to put it in there, but it was so ahead of its time.
Oh, even not so long ago when I was on Mike Wallace on 60 Minutes did a show on alternative journalism and interviewed me and asked me what it meant. So I said, well, in this cartoon, because if you remember Rosemary's Baby, the movie, had some Scrabble letters which were being shuffled around, and they spelled out, and they were an anagram for the name of a warlock that was in the movie. So this cartoon strip was a parallel to that, about political witchcraft, really. And so Spiro Agnew was then talking about, really putting down the media. So in this, the cartoon, the dying Bobby Kennedy warns that the vice president's name is an anagram. So we showed the Scrabble letters of Spiro Agnew, and then mixed around, it came out to grow a penis. And so I said to Mike Wallace, the difference between underground journalism and overground is that you won't be able to have me on the program saying that. And sure enough, it was cut out. But to me, it was very significant because they had said when Charles Goodell, the New York senator, was running on an anti-Vietnam platform, it was Spiro Agnew who said that he was the Christine Jorgensen of the Republican Party. Christine Jorgensen was the first sex change operation. Uh-huh. And so it was just interesting to me that warmongering should be equated with masculinity.
Yes.
You know, that old macho myth. So that it was an appropriate coincidence that almost blew my mind, that his name really literally spelled that out when you changed the letters.
But the cartoon, it tells in just so many visual images here exactly what the story is and how America is raped, and it has the Statue of Liberty lying on the table with this big television over her and these various personages, and they're the kind of personalities that are created by the media, the Martha Mitchell and
Well,
Richard
they changed.
Nixon.
Let me tell you that. An interesting thing happened with that, Mae. Ken Kesey saw this cartoon and he said to me, that cartoon kind of wrote itself, didn't it? And I said, yeah, sort of, because what happened, originally, among the characters standing over in the Coven, watching the Statue of Liberty being raped by this giant TV set with, and its penis was a horn of plenty.
Uh-huh.
And originally, among the people there was the Flying Nun. She was changed into Martha Mitchell because you could see the transformation of Martha Mitchell coming
images,
about.
Yeah.
Then also, Chet Huntley was there. And Chet Huntley dropped out of the Huntley-Brinkley newscast, and he was replaced in this cartoon by Spiro Agnew. So the cartoon evolved. It was really an interesting evolution of a cartoon form.
So, and besides publishing, Paul does a marvelous act of entertaining. I saw him at the Elgin Theater in New York, a Lenny Bruce type of thing, which I really enjoyed. It was amazing as a form of entertainment. I mean, we really need today somebody out there. I remember the years of Mort Sahl. He's become very big now with Vegas, and he's very isolated, remote from the people, even though he tells good stories. And I remember the days where he carried his newspapers under his arm and read the news, and that was a nightclub act. It's sort of like my bringing a hunk of papers here into KLRB, which we did today, even though we talked about certain things we wanted to talk about in advance. And just going through today's headlines is a story. It's a tragedy and a comedy, and it takes precedence over any other thing.
Uh-huh. But one of the differences was between, say, Mort Sahl and myself, because we all started working around that same time, the early 50s, was I've been a participant, as one of the original founders of the Yippies. I was there as an organizer. I was there speaking at demonstrations, going to Chicago, going to anti-war demonstrations, civil rights demonstrations,
You were out in the
marching.
streets.
Yeah, I was out in the streets. So I brought onto the stage the comedic perspective that I understood, translating from the seriousness of what I learned on the streets. the thing that I got most notorious for, I mean, the Realist published, I never labeled whether something was satire or serious journalism, because I felt that the newspapers don't say when they're giving you propaganda or journalism, so it would be good to train the readers to be suspicious of the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times as they would be of the Realist. So I would run the first serious article by Eric Norden on the murder of Malcolm X, tying the CIA and the New York Police Department collaboration behind that. I also ran, in 1967, an article called The Parts Left Out of the Kennedy Book. And
you outraged the researchers.
It was I based it on a lot of information I had been given from reporters that never could get into print about Kennedy, and then I had one scene in it, which I won't tell yet because I want to read this letter, this FBI letter. Because this shows that even satire is not safe in a police state.
No, even among some of the researchers, I know I started studying the Kennedy assassination in November '63, and I was taking the Realist in '67, and I wasn't offended by the part you did about Lyndon Johnson, but there were people like Harold Weisberg in Maryland who were so offended that if you just mention your name now, he turns livid, and he won't quote anything from my Realist articles, no matter how good my research is, because I put it in the Realist.
Don't you think that's just as irresponsible of him?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's childish. I think it's terrible. I think you have to have a sense of humor. If you lose your sense of humor, you're in trouble. And if you can't tell fact from fiction, you're in pretty bad shape. And if you can't, you should investigate, you see, and check your sources. But I think it's a tragedy when people are so involved so seriously.
Well, there were some researchers who thought that I was a CIA agent, or that I had been given misinformation by the CIA in order to discredit the serious researchers.
Probably. Paul brought some information here about how he was discredited. I think that one of the important things, Mort Sahl was blackballed, and you were certainly economically cut off from a lot of things.
Well, there was a lot of stuff happening which you begin to wonder whether it's paranoia or real. So that I had been supporting the Realist. It never took any advertising, so I supported it I was a film critic for Cavalier magazine. And after I testified in the Chicago trial, 3 wholesalers told the publisher they would no longer distribute it if my name was in it. So they fired me.
Well, that's not paranoia.
But I went to the wholesalers to find out. They said they were harassed by FBI. But I had no evidence. They didn't want to testify. They were scared for their job, so I could never prove it. So people kept saying I was paranoid. I finally sent for my FBI and my CIA files, and I got them. And they don't know what they're doing. They're like, the FBI tries to be artistic critics, and they say, Krassner talked about the war, purporting to be funny.
Purporting.
Yeah.
Funny war.
So then I got some letters from the Senate Select Committee investigating intelligence activities, and it included some FBI correspondence that was not in my FBI files.
And the committee told you that they had it, but the FBI hadn't told you.
So I wrote to the FBI asking for copies of those letters and asking why it was not included in my FBI file. So here's my letter back from Clarence Kelly, Director, January 28th, 1977. Dear Mr. Krassner, in response to your letter of January 10th, 1977, enclosed are copies of memoranda requested by you. In reply to your inquiry, please note that the subject of the memoranda is COINTELPRO New Left and was not indexed under your name.
Oh, what a bummer. In other words, if I wrote something about the era, it would be under Vietnam or John Kennedy.
Well, who knows? Who knows what their game is? Could just be inefficiency or.
And what is your Freedom of Information Act? What did they do to you, the FBI, during these years? You have your.
Well, they tried. They kept. It showed that they wanted to get charges against me for Chicago, but they said they couldn't get even what they considered evidence because I had such a low profile. Yeah, right. But here's what the memorandum they sent me. This was a memorandum from the New York office of the FBI to the director's office in Washington, and the code name next it says. First, they tell why they're doing this. They wanted to get permission to send a letter to Life magazine. Life magazine had done a story on me in October '68 that was very favorable and got some response. So that meant that I was becoming
reasonable.
Acceptable, if not reasonable. That unreasonableness was becoming acceptable.
Okay.
So it said to memorandum to Director FBI from SAC New York. I forget what SAC stands for.
Special section.
Oh,
yeah.
not Strategic Air Command?
No.
Subject COINTELPRO New Left. The October 4th, 1968 issue of Life magazine contained a 3-page feature on Paul Krassner, editor of Realist and self-styled hippie. I guess that means I didn't go to hippie school.
Self-styled.
Yeah, right. I let my hair grew. My hair grew by itself. It
Spontaneous blue
right.
jeans. They weren't washed 100 times before they were
right.
sold.
Exactly.
Okay.
You didn't get them at
the natural dirt.
Okay.
Okay.
It says Krassner's carried on the RI of the NYO. Now, the Senate Select Committee told me that meant that I was on a list to be rounded up.
Oh. By John Mitchell and G. Gordon
right,
Liddy?
That's their code.
Okay.
Then it said, Bureau authority is requested to send the following letter to the editors of Life on an anonymous basis. It is noted that the Life article was favorable to Krassner. All right, now this is the letter. It said, Sirs, your recent issue, October 4th, which devoted 3 pages to the aggrandizement of underground editor Paul Krassner, was too much. You must be hard up for material. Am I asking the impossible by requesting that Krassner and his ilk be left in the sewers where they belong? That a national magazine of your fine reputation, till now that is, would waste time and effort on the cuckoo editor of an unimportant, smutty little rag is incomprehensible to me. Gentlemen, you must be aware that Realist is nothing more than blatant obscenity. Your features editor would do well to read a few back issues of the Realist. Try the article in 1963, actually it was in 1967, following the assassination of President Kennedy, which describes disgusting necrophilism on the part of LBJ, as opposed to pleasing necrophilism. To classify Krassner as some sort of social rebel is far too cute. He's a nut, a raving, unconfined nut. As for any possible intellectual rewards to be gleaned from the Realist, much better prose may be found on lavatory walls. If this article is a portent of things to come in life, count me out, gentlemen, count me out. And it was signed Howard Rasmussen, to rhyme with Rasputin, I guess. Brooklyn College School of General Studies.
They must have read the Realist a few times to come. Isn't that amazing?
Oh, of course they read it. Mort Sahl said the FBI probably supported it just with their readership.
The social rebel who's too cute.
Okay, now, so they sent this to Washington, and here's Washington's answer.
Did Life magazine ever print this letter about you? Anonymous?
No, the reason they didn't print it is pretty weird, because I sent them a letter with my own name under it saying, cancel my subscription to Life. How dare you print an article praising that commie, anarchist, pinko, hippie rebel.
Yeah.
And so I did, as a satire, I satirized this FBI letter, which I hadn't seen.
But did Life print the FBI
No, they
letter?
printed my letter because it was funnier.
Oh, and they didn't print Life?
No, but I'm still suing them. I'm suing them for conspiracy to libel and harass, because that's libel per se.
Yes.
And also, it was, even if it wasn't published, it was seen by the people who approved it. The people who approved it were Cartha DeLoach and William Sullivan.
You had the top people of the FBI.
I know,
William
I should
Sullivan
be proud.
From Division 5 has been named in the Kennedy assassination, the Martin Luther King, as I said. DeLoach and Sullivan are the 2 top people.
Those were the 2 when Madame Chennault was getting money from South Vietnam to Nixon, and LBJ was tapping Nixon's phone for that. Those were the 2, Cartha DeLoach and William Sullivan, that the Nixon administration tried to get to find information about LBJ's wiretapping.
Oh my goodness! Right under J. Edgar Hoover, you have the very top people that worrying about the Realist. How do you describe the Realist to listeners? I think one point is how important it was that these people are writing anonymous letters about you, the 2 top dogs under Hoover, the FBI, at a time in the 67, the anti-war movement. That they take the effort and try to stop the freedom of the press, to discourage them from covering anything about you.
See, I don't mind. I wouldn't mind if that were a spontaneous letter, or even if the guy did it on his own time.
But the taxpayers paid
He
for
could
this
have done
one.
it on his own time, as a matter of fact. But for whatever reason, because that was his job. See, I want to know what else.
But they got an order to write an anonymous letter?
I want to know what. Yeah, I'll read that to you now.
So the taxpayers are really funding these.
The taxpayer, yeah,
their
that's
salary
part
to
of it.
sit down and order the Realist and read.
Right, and it's not the function of the FBI to be literary critics.
No,
it's supposed to find
not even
fight
for
crime
what's
or
on the
something.
lavatory walls, really.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The rationale for doing it is included in their note.
Yeah.
Okay, so they COINTELPRO New Left dated October 16, 1968. Authority is granted to send a letter, signed with a fictitious name, to the editors of Life magazine. Furnish the Bureau the results of your action. Then they say, note. Now, when I sent to the FBI for these letters, they sent me this material back, and the following note was eliminated. There was just blank white space there. Because in my lawsuit, see, what they said about me is true. I am a raving, unconfined nut. And the Realist is blatant obscenity. But truth is not a defense when you have malice. And so they cut out the part of their memo approving it, which showed that the FBI had malice.
Oh.
Which was this. It said, note, they don't say in here that he really is a nut. He really is obscene. What they say is, quote, Krassner is the editor of The Realist and is one of the moving forces behind the Youth International Party, commonly known as the Yippies. Krassner is a spokesman for the New Left. Life magazine recently ran an article favorable to him. New York's proposed letter takes issue with the publishing of this article and points out that The Realist is obscene and that Krassner is a nut. The letter could, if printed by Life, call attention to the unsavory character of Krassner.
Oh, that's marvelous.
See, it's really insidious.
Yeah, that's really good. The areas, say, of these letters to the editor, where's paranoia, where are people prompted to send in things because the agencies have to destroy their personalities, and the people at large in the country don't even feel that way or know anything about you. Moves in strange ways. I went through my own paranoia this week with the government because when I went to see Jim Garrison in New Orleans in 1967, and that's the same time that you were being harassed by the FBI, and that's the year that Lyndon Johnson ordered the FBI to get the researchers, blackmail them and photograph them and so forth. And I went to New Orleans for a few days to present this evidence to Jim Garrison that linked in with his work on the conspiracy. And I thought the plane that I was on would go back to San Francisco, but it stopped at Dallas. And at that time, there was what they said, a bomb on the plane, and they took my luggage and kept my research there for 3 or 4 days. But there were about 100 people on the plane, and the Dallas policeman came right up to where I was sitting on the plane and took me to this room and said, will you come here? And all the other passengers were in the main foyer of the airport, and they went through their luggage like you go through customs and everything. And it was a fairly good-sized room, and the 2 Dallas cops sat at the door, so I couldn't get out. And somebody said, well, why don't you force your way out? I got to phone my family and tell them about being late on the connections from San Francisco here. But I had to sit in a chair. It was sort of like, this is Gary Gilmore sitting in a chair in the back of a room. And I stayed there, and then finally I was the last one released, and they went through my luggage, and then when I went to San Francisco, they had kept my books. And when I got home, I was sick, and I went to bed, and everything went around. I usually don't react by getting dizzy, and I was physically, the bed was going around and around, and I was very ill. And I'd called a friend who's an attorney, and he also works with doctors. He's at UC Medical School in San Francisco teaching ethics of medicine. He's interested in, works with pharmacies. And he said to me quite casually, well, you probably had radiation, that they were giving you radiation. And I said, you're kidding. I mean, this was in 67, and I wasn't screaming or yelling for my rights. And he said, you obviously had some doses that they put through the wall or ceiling. And he asked me where I was sitting and where the cops were sitting, And it stayed in the back of my mind, and it didn't even, it wasn't anything I really talked about, but I wondered, am I going to get a cancer, 10 years from now, such as I just read recently that people in prison in Chile were given injections last year, and that they were released from prison 3 years from now, their kidneys will shrivel up and they'll die, and they can't blame the prison condition. And I sat with that, and then last week I had this tumor on my arm for the last 2 years, and I think I really put it off, knowing it was benign, but not wondering, is it cancer or is it just a lump, And last week I went in the hospital and had this tumor removed from my arm, and the doctor said it was benign and it wasn't a cancer, and that it could latch the muscle. That's why I had it taken off. But all the time, I didn't even talk about with family or friends. My mind went back to Dallas in 67, like, were they doing it then? Or was this one of those chances that you would have a cancer? It would show up now. But what is paranoia and what is legitimate fear when a medical lawyer, a lawyer trained in medicine, is saying very matter-of-factly, yes, they're doing this to people?
Well, I think that they deliberately try to psych you out. When I published your original article, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped?, I was living in Watsonville then, near Santa Cruz, and I had a small place in San Francisco because I had a radio show there, which I lost. And also I was told that there was pressure from the government about that. Just as Dan O'Neill, who did a cartoon strip for the Chronicle in San Francisco, was told by people in the Chronicle that they had been pressured by the government to drop his comic strip.
Yeah.
So the people who babysat my house in Watsonville said that there was a helicopter constantly flying over it that weekend that I was gone. And then the same thing happened in San Francisco. The house where I was staying, there was a helicopter over it all the time.
And there were people on your beach a lot, too, right?
Yeah, there was they said they were looking for a rapist. And but they looked like a Mission Impossible squad.
Yeah.
So it's you keep thinking, well, maybe they really are looking for a rapist.
But there are no rapes in the area, no police reports or anything.
Well, it was just strange. It finally caused me to freak out because but luckily I didn't go to some CIA hospital or anything. I just stayed with friends until I got my perspective back. But it was a scary time because you know that they were capable of doing that.
Well, when I look back in 1972, and it's just been 5 years since Paul and I met. It's been 5 years since that story that came out, June of 72. But we met around February, March of 72. And when we had that press conference in Los Angeles in August 72, why was Martha Mitchell kidnapped? And I look back, and I was rereading the article this morning, coming in with Paul and thinking maybe we'd bring up some of the things that we published together 5 years ago. And when you realize how heavy that article was, I mean, they could have done one or two things, either done us both in or just ignored us and took another line of attack of following Watergate with the nearest cover story and not letting these things come out, because there's so much that we had in that press conference. They're even talking about why was Martha Mitchell kidnapped and she's dead.
Well, see, because that's right. You say, what about her book? She never got a chance to write her book.
What about her injection that we wrote about in the article? And we sat there like you'd been in the journalism business for so many years by then, and you had had many press conferences and you'd been on the stage and radio. But here we sat with the Associated Press, United Press, and it was my first article, my first press conference, and we're saying Richard Nixon was involved in Watergate, and John Mitchell was hired Liddy for the Liddy plan, and Charles.
They
Colson,
weren't ready for you.
They weren't ready
any more than any say some kind of biological theoretical physicist or something would have some new theory. They just were not ready for it.
They just sat
so
there.
You can't even blame them for it.
No, but I wonder now, as an establishment news media sat there, and Leroy Aarons from the Washington Post, and it was 9 months before Woodward and Bernstein or James McCord were making ripples, and they were sitting here and all the plans were laid out for them. I wonder what they thought of the two of us explaining the whole Watergate thing to them. I mean, the odd couple, Mae Brussell, the housewife, and the mother of all these kids, sitting home in Carmel without any budget of investigative work and laying the whole thing out, and you, the publisher, just saying the whole thing. Right?
Somebody said to me, this was a guy who gave a copy to Representative Ron Dellums, and he said Dellums turned pale. But he said to me, he says, "You've been publishing all these years funny stuff just to be able to get to this, haven't you?" I said, "No, it just worked out that way." But what happened was I was scared enough that I took hundreds and hundreds of copies, brought them to every reporter I ever knew.
Well, I remember.
There was a conference in Washington, D.C. I brought hundreds of copies there with me. I handed them out.
I remember to Congress and before the congressional...
I gave one to Daniel Schorr at the time, and he was looking through it. And he said, "That's interesting." He said, "But what is this about?" Because this was, people still were saying that Watergate was a caper at that time.
That's right. Yeah.
Third-rate burglary, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to
a few
second-rate
Cubans
burglary.
that went off, ran.
So Daniel Schorr said he happened to come upon this point where you were talking about Teddy Kennedy and Chappaquiddick possibly being part of a conspiracy to discredit him. You don't have to kill a candidate, a potential candidate, physically kill him in order to ruin his political career. So he said, "Well, that's a little bit far-fetched." And I said, "Look, if I told you the stuff that's happening today, 5 years ago, you would have said that's far-fetched." He said, "Yes, that's true." He said, "But this Teddy Kennedy stuff taints the rest of the issue."
I know.
And a few years later, Daniel Schorr found himself to be victimized by the very same system.
That's right. And the funny thing was that when I talked about Ted Kennedy being knocked out as a candidate for president, at the time of the Senate Watergate hearings, Tony Laswitz said that he was up at Chappaquiddick the night of the accident. And Herbert Kalmbach testified that he gave Tony Laswitz $100,000 in June, and the accident took place a month later. And just last week, I was reading an article in Counterspy that Denise, the chief of police up at Chappaquiddick, is a Portuguese who has a shortwave radio station at Chappaquiddick that reaches across the ocean, and that he is actually training mercenaries for the CIA to invade Portugal for the extreme right wing. And part of the invasion troop is in Spain, and part is up at Chappaquiddick. And, so that and again...
Do you think he was already doing that, or that happened after as his reward for keeping quiet?
Well, I don't know, but when I wrote about the article, Martha Mitchell kidnapping, I wrote about Robert Bennett and Mullen Associates, which was a CIA front where the planning of Watergate took place. Bennett worked in the Department of Transportation with Mr. DeMott, one of the police agents who was up at Chappaquiddick, and he knew him up there, and E. Howard Hunt had contacts and was working always on Chappaquiddick stories to defame Ted Kennedy. And so I don't believe that Denise just suddenly turned a police agent. It's interesting that Mr. Woods, the father of one of the defendants in the Chowchilla case, owns hundreds of acres at Martha's Vineyard. And for all we know, many of those people could have been in the intelligence community, for a long time, and they certainly knew the police chief and the investigators, because there was cold turkey in investigating it, and the girls and everybody were airlifted off the island and never questioned. There was no questioning about whether Ted Kennedy even drove the car. There was no evidence he even drove the car.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just want to say one thing in relation to this. When I first published it, and I knew that cartoon, that 4-page cartoon called Rosemerica's Baby, could be considered kind of raunchy, I asked Mae how she felt about it, because I had never asked the writer ever about how they felt about their material appearing with other raunchy material in the same issue. But I felt particularly responsible about this, and I felt also schizophrenic, because I was putting myself in a position of maybe if Mae didn't approve of it, I would have to consider leaving it out, and it would have been a real editorial conflict for me. But what Mae said was really important, because I guess it applies even now to somebody like Larry Flint in Hustler magazine. Mae said, well, include the cartoon in the same issue with the conspiracy stuff, because they both stem from the same freedom.
Yeah.
And I was at the printer when she said to me that, and it was
You
just
feel
an
good?
incredible relief. Yeah, sure.
And we were vindicated later when Conrad came out with a cartoon of the baby buddy in Washington, and the two eyes were the reals, and they said Rosemary's Baby. Remember? It took a whole historic turn back there. No, I don't believe, if you're printing my article, that I have any say over the other things that you're printing.
I know, but I'm saying it was it just felt so important at the time that I was willing to sacrifice my own principle.
Yeah.
I felt skitsy about it, but I considered it. Anyway, for the rest of the time, why don't we just talk about stuff that's happening currently,
5 years later?
especially as to destroy the myth that Watergate is over.
Yeah, Paul and I were talking about that because he was down in Carmel doing an article this weekend, and we talked about a lot of different subjects, as we always do. And usually during the week, I take the clippings from my 10 newspapers and magazines and mail coming in from around the country, and I put it in a basket now, and usually Saturday or Sunday I separate it like a deck of cards into 52 different subjects and file them and pull out for KLRB what's important. And there's so much in the news, and I know that Paul, it's hard if you're not seeing 10 papers a day sliced up to realize how much is going on.
Well, the thing that's overwhelming is because most people don't have the time, energy, or inclination to do that much reading of newspapers. And so they're limited by what their own paper presents to them. But when you see the broad perspective that Mae had, you could see, well, this is happening in Philadelphia, this is happening in Texas. You can see a pattern which makes it much more frightening than because you realize that they depend on your isolation to keep you in ignorance.
That's right. Well, I think this article about the interview with Castro is important today, because it's important, say, as the publisher, The Realist, because getting down to the facts of life and not bullying people around or teasing them with things that are not true. I think the honesty of Fidel Castro with Bradley, it was important in terms of human rights. And these are the things we're working for. And calling up the hypocrisy of Jimmy Carter and talking about human rights in opening up. And we can talk about some of these things, take turns on some of these different issues, because Mr. Bradley went down to see Fidel Castro and had an article in the Washington Post, which is in the paper today, and Castro said, well, I'll take the first one. He says, don't talk to Fidel Castro about truly right, about human rights. he's telling Jimmy Carter, he says he has nothing to learn from the United States. And he says they relentlessly try to assassinate Cuba's leader for 21 years, and this is no longer speculative, you know? And we can go down about what he says about these other human rights. You know, what does Cuba have to learn about human rights? He says, what about the war in Vietnam? It cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Now, this is a man who could increase...
Or even the thing that was on 60 Minutes last night about the Wilmington 10.
Yeah.
As well as the Iranian students. You know, I mean, where we...
locking up our own people.
I don't suppose that the Iranian intelligence could be here in the numbers that they are doing what they do without the permission and maybe even guidance of American intelligence, right?
Well, the same way the anti-Castro Cubans can't be doing what they're doing without the permission and training of the CIA.
Uh-huh.
And Jimmy Carter talks about human rights and sends a letter to Russia. And I think the courage that Castro has is that even though he needs trade with us and he's terribly isolated, he's not afraid to say the truth.
Uh-huh.
Even if he loses the disfavor, he's not... It's sort of like the stuff that you've published. Even if you go for broke over a long stretch of years, you're still not afraid to say what's coming out.
And it wasn't even courage. You know, you just do it because it's natural to communicate without compromise if you're fortunate enough to be in that position. So now you'll have 60 Minutes, a network program, beginning to talk about stuff. You'll have McCall's magazine with one of the editors doing an article on the assassination of Kennedy and saying with surprise, why, this is bigger than Watergate. You know, it's like they've just stumbled upon it. But they've been brainwashed. You know, it's hard to blame people for having been brainwashed.
Yeah, well, Fidel Castro says that the United States has supported every totalitarian regime in Latin America, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, Mobutu, and Diem, you know, in Southeast Asia, and Park in South Korea. I was saying this on KLRB last week. You know, he talks about our troops in the Philippines.
I did the same thing in my Berkeley Barb column. I did it... I acted as if I was agreeing with Carter and saying, yes, he's right, we should have human rights in Cuba. Fidel Castro should agree never again to ask the CIA to have the mafia kill him.
But, you know, America has a way of being so clumsy, like they'll invite the Trudeaus over and then they criticize what Mrs. Trudeau is wearing, you know, which is so rude. And many times things have happened in the White House where they take one step forward and two back. And here's an example where the Washington Post has gone over with feelers and permission, obviously, for the State Department to interview Castro and see what's going on. And so at the same time that they're over in Cuba, the Carlos Siqueiros is being interviewed by Cirus Vance down in Miami, the leader of the anti-Castro Cubans, whose name was linked to the John Kennedy assassination, who has strong ties to the Watergate defendants and the CIA. He's former president of Cuba, and Fidel Castro says that Prio and others were infamous. And he made a remark that, why don't you try and look at us through our eyes? You know, Batista was cruel and just as cruel as anything that Castro did, and he's saying, look at it from where we're at, but it isn't enough to make an overture. They have to counteract it by the head of the State Department meeting with Siqueiros in Miami.
Well, I think there was a phrase I used before about politics being the art of balancing between the status quo and the force of evolution. And so they know, just as they knew that ultimately we would have to establish relations with China, they know that the same thing is happening in Cuba, so that baseball is going to do the trick instead of ping pong.
Yeah, but why doesn't the interview of Siqueiros with Cirus Vance get put away for 4 or 5 weeks to let Castro explain how he feels? And later, we know Vance meets with these people all the time. Why do they have to do it the same day? The same day that...
probably as competition.
You see, I put out a theory which in the car coming over here, which I can share with the listeners. But I feel this way, that the assassination of John Kennedy was blamed upon Lee Harvey Oswald, first as a loner, then maybe contacts with the Cubans, or frustration because Marina wouldn't sleep with him the weekend before the assassination. And
I know, every time I get rejected, I want to go out and kill somebody.
And you know, the Sirhan story, the Israeli-Palestine situation was as a veiled motive for Sirhan without going into the fact of whether he even killed Robert Kennedy or not. But I feel very strongly that Jimmy Carter is in a position in the White House always vulnerable to assassinations, and that deals could be made with any one of the anti-Castro Cubans who've been trained for violence, and that the overture for rapprochement for Cuba would be the signal to kill Jimmy Carter by the anti-Castro Cuban community, and they can say, oh, they acted out of emotion. I think Jimmy Carter is walking as thin a line as
But
John
Jimmy
Kennedy
Carter was
did.
smart. He got somebody to the left of him for vice president.
Yeah, but he wouldn't win another election 4 years from now. Maybe I doubt if Mondale on his own would win. See, and I feel that he's probably too liberal to run for president. He could be appointed. But I feel that the overtures to the anti-Castro community by someone like Cirus Vance is inviting an assassination of Jimmy Carter by a Cuban, and that we have to take into consideration that he's completely surrounded by the people who are disloyal to John Kennedy that work for John Kennedy. So that if you have a rerun of the John Kennedy assassination with the Robert Kennedy assassination, you have Jimmy Carter always vulnerable to the kind of deals that they're capable of making and cover it. I think he's in a dangerous position. He has to recognize Cuba eventually, or he will want to, but they can still work with the anti-Castro Cuban community that are CIA.
Do you think that that's why one of the reasons why Ted Sorenson was not approved as head of the CIA, because he was so involved with the Bay of Pigs and with possibly even the death of Che Guevara?
No, I think Ted Sorensen was a smokescreen. I believe that this Mr. Turner, Admiral Turner, was selected a long time ago for the CIA, and that they knew that Sorensen would be knocked out. As a matter of fact, I read an article that, there's a lot of snakes in the grass, and I read an article that Kenny O'Donnell, who used to work with Sorensen, was the one who called up the CIA and the State Department and leaked things about Sorensen so that he wasn't appointed. So that Sorensen could be a thing like an Eagleton case, because immediately after the appointment was made of Admiral Turner from West Point, his classmate, to take the job of the CIA, then the Hussein story was broken by the Washington Post, which caused Turner immediately to say we should criminally prosecute anybody who has leaks. And I don't think that Sorensen would have taken that position. I think that the leaks, the Hussein story, has been sitting in Washington for several years. See, and I think it was synchronized to make Jimmy Carter look like a liberal, like I would have appointed him, but they didn't. Because nobody else on his cabinet is anything but a fascist. Why would you have somebody who even looks like they're...
Before Henry Kissinger became part of Nixon's administration, he was hoping that Cirus Vance would be the Secretary of State.
For Nixon.
Yeah, for Nixon.
That's right. I mean, if you get everyone who's farther right than Rockefeller on Jimmy Carter's cabinet, then Sorensen was an obvious misfit. I never thought he was a liberal, but the liberals don't know the difference. I mean, they'd put in Ramsey Clark and think he's a liberal. Or, I have a lot of opinions about people like Katzenbach, who is the Assistant Attorney General under Lyndon Johnson. Nicholas Katzenbach, he's the lawyer for IBM now, one of their big lawyers. And I feel that the Sorensen thing was to give Jimmy Carter the appearance like he has no, except for Edward Young, no real blacks or Chicanos or people. He said he'd have all new faces in Washington. And actually, the only new face is an admiral from Navy intelligence. And yet all the conspiracy work, assassination work I've done, all the clues to importation of the Nazis, all the secrecy, whether it was Nixon or Gerald Ford or Patrick Gray, are from Annapolis. All Navy intelligence, all these people from Navy intelligence that really run the show, Admiral Moore and the bugging Richard Nixon in the White House. So I think that this person that was selected a long time ago. If Carter came in, I don't see that. But as far as the news going on since Watergate, there's hundreds of articles. One that caught your attention that I had here was this one on the Chowchilla thing.
What I had forgotten was that the Chowchilla school bus kidnapping took place on the same day that Jimmy Carter was nominated, so that it almost made, and that was the biggest story of 1976, even bigger than the Patty Hearst kidnapping.
Was it?
And according to the surveys of the newspapers themselves, and so the fact now that it could be it's really an interesting hypocrisy, because on one hand, there's supposed to be children under 10 are considered not competent to testify.
So they may throw out the trial.
But children of 13 are considered okay to bribe. In what was that other case where they bribed a 13-year-old?
In Dallas, Texas, recently, they were dealing in marijuana. The kids had $100,000 or something. There's a large amount of money. The big thing is like in the Watergate, where people weren't prosecuted, and they were paid off, and everything was hushed up. They got a slap on the wrist. The fact that the indictments could be imperiled for Chowchilla is so dangerous. It's outrageous that they dropped this case against him, and yet they're toying with the idea, and they're toying with the idea of discrediting the bus driver, which is what they did.
So, but what that means is that it's an excuse to change the rules for coddling, for supposedly coddling criminals.
Yes.
That's how I interpret it.
I think it's really a dangerous problem. Oh, I do have one local problem here. It's not a problem. We have 1 minute to go, and I do want to say that the elections of school boards tomorrow are taking place in Carmel, and there's only one candidate that I do know, Sylvia Chase, who attended my conspiracy course at MPC College several years ago and is interested in current problems and is well trained in a lot of areas of mental health and education, and a lot of people don't bother to go to vote to these things. But if you live in the Carmel-Monterey area and you want to vote for somebody on the Monterey Peninsula on the school board there, I recommend Sylvia Chase, because I know of her efforts to keep her continuous education going, and that's important. Well, our time is up. This went quickly. All of a sudden, I look at the clock. Paul, thank you for staying over to do this show.
Okay, I was just in town to give you this bribe from the Korean embassy.
Well, where is it?
Huh? Well, I kept half.
It's really good. We've been working together and published things. I've published in The Realist. It's been 5 years now. We're still friends. That's part of a record, don't you think?
Right, but that's only because we have something on each other.
Oh, no, we don't. Really.
Mutual blackmail society.
No, we don't. Thanks for coming, Carmel, and staying over and doing the show. And we'll do it again soon, okay?
Okay.
Okay, this is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. We'll see you next Monday on Dialogue Conspiracy.
This has been Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for many years has been researching the facts behind political assassinations and conspiracies in this country. Dialogue Conspiracy originates with KLRB FM in Carmel, California.